Well, at the core of the cost of living crisis ripping through Australian households, of course, has been rampant inflation. Soaring prices have mercilessly sapped people's buying power for more than 2 years now. And with great grief to millions, the Reserve Bank's been hammering them with multiple interest rate rises. Well, there's no doubt it's working. Inflation's well and truly peaked and is dropping. Now there's only about 1 percentage point to go until it gets back towards the magic target of 3% or below. So could the worst of the mortgage squeeze and all the spending constrictions that come from it now be over? A reprieve is certainly closer than it has been for a couple of years, but we'll seek the views of experts this Wednesday, recognising Ngunnawal and other custodians of land around Canberra. I'm Greg Jennett. You're watching Afternoon Briefing. Also today, for the best part of a decade, federal, state and territory governments have all been slugging it out over full and fair rates of funding for public schools across the land. Well, these days, the Albanese government accepts it does need to dig a little deeper, financially speaking, and the states do too. So to that end, a provisional deal has been done in Western Australia that has implications for school funding in all states and territories. We will be catching up with Jason Clare, the Education Minister from Perth. That's coming up a little later. Yes, now those inflation figures out today, there were in fact 2 sets of them, not only show that upward pressure on prices slowed down over the months of October, November and December, they also show that by the final month of last year, inflation was falling away very quickly indeed, with a 3 in front of the monthly figure for December. Now that could indicate the pace of inflation reduction is picking up in a sustained way. Jim Chalmers, though, isn't treating the fire-eating dragon as slayed just yet, but he does seem satisfied that the inflation fight is gradually being won.
If you think about 2024, what we're seeing here is inflation is slowing, real wages is growing, and from the 1st of July we will see tax cuts flowing. We've had 2 consecutive quarters of real wages growth. We're seeing welcome and encouraging moderation in inflation, and from the 1st of July every Australian taxpayer will get a tax cut, but 84% of Australians will get a bigger tax cut to deal with the cost of living pressures that we still see in our economy. This is not mission accomplished, but it's really welcome and it's really encouraging progress.
Yeah, so that's the government takeout. Let's get some insights now on what the inflation figures might mean for the broader economy, but more particularly for interest rates. Barrenjoey senior economist Jonathan McMenamin joins us now. Welcome to the program, Jonathan. Why don't we start with an initial observation? Were you surprised by the speed with which inflation fell? And I ask that both, through the quarterly figures, but also specifically in December.
Yeah, I think we were surprised. And if you look at market expectations, there was this general sense of a slight downside miss. If you look at the quarterly data specifically, you can see that across the headline print there were downside misses around 0.2% lower in the quarter than many people had been expecting. And really a lot of that surprise came from key items like electricity prices, where we saw the introduction of subsidies within WA reducing electricity prices. But there were also some surprises right across the basket, which really lowered that underlying rate of inflation, which is really what the RBA cares about.
Okay.
If you talk about the monthly prints as well, there we saw quite a sharp deceleration, again related to that electricity price momentum coming out.
And so just picking up on that latter point, Jonathan, does that, do you think, presage a faster rate of reduction in the next set of monthlies, obviously when they come through for January?
Yeah, so when we look ahead into the coming months, you will start seeing that subsidy that came in WA come out as people consume that subsidy on their bill. So we should see upward pressure from things like electricity prices in the coming months. But in saying all of that, the weakness across the broader basket of inflation, the inflation basket, particularly within the tradables component, should see inflation sort of hover around 3.5% for the next 3 months or so.
Okay, so just to tease out some of those sticky, more stubborn areas of inflation pressure, rents, insurance and other financial services, Jonathan, alcohol and tobacco, I think also some health expenses, they remain stubbornly high, don't they? And you're saying that's likely to continue?
That's right. So really the way we tend to think about the inflation basket is in two halves. The first half is those tradable items, things that are exposed to global trends. And this is what you're seeing globally. Goods in particular are falling in price or they're disinflating, meaning that their rate of growth is slowing. And then in the non-tradables component, the stuff that's domestically based, like rents, for example, and construction costs and insurance, those things are showing quite a bit of persistence and are all running above their normal rates of growth. And this is why we think that inflation has come down quite quickly to this 3.5% rate, but is unlikely to get back within the band in the next couple quarters. It will take a little bit longer. There are some encouraging signs within some parts of services, like if we look at hairdressers, for example, dentists and a few other household services, and those things are showing a fair bit of disinflation too.
Right, that might bring some comfort to the Governor of the Reserve Bank, who I think previously and publicly has identified at least one of those services as being a little too high. Why don't we move on to their deliberations, though? The Reserve Bank will, I suppose, be gratified that prices are doing exactly what they want them to do, moderating. It meets for the first time this year, next week. What's Barrenjoey's prediction, Jonathan, for future moves by them, even if it doesn't come as soon as next week?
Yeah, so I think they'll take a lot of encouragement out of this data. As I said, that broadening of disinflation into other non-tradable items will be the thing that's most encouraging, and that softer trim mean expectation. We saw it within the trim mean, so this is the measure that cuts out all the volatile items on either side of the basket, came in at 4.2%, and the RBA had been expecting 4.5%. So this is really the key reason why we don't think the RBA will again hike rates during this cycle. We think they're on hold for now. And actually, we see the first cut from the Reserve Bank starting from August. But it's important to remember with this cutting cycle that it's not a cutting cycle that is going to be steep, one which would see us go back down to, say, 1.5% or even lower that we saw prior to the pandemic. This is going to be a very gradual easing of the interest rate cycle. And that's because the economy on the other side of all this will be supported by things like the Stage 3 income tax cuts.
Okay, so why don't we move on to those, and assuming, of course, that they are legislated, they start showing up in people's pay from the month of July. Could it be that the worst of the cost of living pressures are well past by then, that in some senses they miss their mark, at least as measured against the government's stated purpose for meddling with them?
So they will come at the end of the inflation spike. So they will be around where we'll have inflation near around 3%. So they'll be coming when inflation is lower. But I think it's really important to remember that if you compare Australia relative to other OECD countries, since this outbreak of inflation started, we've had the largest decline in real income. So that's income growth less inflation. So we've had the largest decline in real incomes across the OECD. And that means that people's purchasing power has actually fallen outright. And that's why an income tax cut in any form can be quite important for the Australian economy, because what it will do is increase people's purchasing power. And really that's how they feel their standards of living. So any tax cut in any frame will help support that. And, you know, if we look further out, it's likely that we will see more tax cuts in the years ahead as we address this amount of bracket creep we've seen.
Right, bracket creep. And your argument there, Jonathan McMenamin, would support the Treasury's assertion that, in fact, there's no reason to be worried about undue inflationary pressure coming from those Stage 3 cuts.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's really important to note here that everyone's expectation was that we would get the stage 3 income tax cuts. They were going to cost $20 billion. This package looks like it's going to be $21 billion. And obviously more money is going to go to people that are more likely to spend it lower in the income spectrum. But because those were already part of our baseline expectations, the change is marginal for what it means for the economy. And in the scope of a $2.5 trillion economy, the change is quite small. So it's unlikely to produce much in the way of extra inflation because of the change.
All right, well, certainly a bit to digest from those inflation figures today for us, for you, and also for the Reserve Bank and the government. Jonathan McMenamin, we thank you for that, and we'll wrap up. We'll get you back on the program before too long.
Thank you so much. Cheers.
All right, the first of what should become a national sweep of new public school funding agreements is close to being locked in now. Jason Clare has struck an in-principle deal with West Australian Premier Roger Cook for both levels of government, his and Roger Cook's, to increase their share of school funding over 5 years. Now, all up, it should deliver more than $1 billion in extra funding to state schools in the West over a 5-year period, and also stand as a beacon of encouragement for other states to follow suit and sign up. We caught up with the Federal Education Minister from East Hamersley Primary School in Perth. Well, Jason Clare, thanks for joining us there from Western Australia. A fair bit of activity happening around Perth at the moment. Throughout this year, your job will be to clinch these new 5-year school funding agreements with all states. You're starting there with what's called a statement of intent. Before we get to what this extra funding will buy, and we'll get to that, run us through the numbers. By how much in total will public school funding increase in Western Australia?
Yeah, well, g'day mates and Happy New Year. This is a landmark day for public education today. Today we're announcing that Western Australia will become the first state in the country where all public schools here are fully funded, and that'll come in from 2026. The most disadvantaged schools here in WA will be fully funded next year, and then all schools, all public schools in WA will be fully funded from 2026. You ask how much that is, that works out at around about $777 million of extra Commonwealth investment, matched by a similar amount from the WA government, to get us there to that full funding level that David Gonski talked about all those years ago. Private schools are at that level now. Public schools aren't, right across the country except the ACT. And this investment today will mean that WA becomes the first state in the country where public schools are fully funded at that full funding level.
I think as you broaden this out and bag deals state by state, nationally, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're budgeting on about an extra $3 billion a year on top in Commonwealth funding alone. Where does that come from, though? How much of that is all new money? Will any of it be clawed back from non-government schools?
Well, it's a significant investment. It's a significant investment. The actual final amount will depend upon the deals that we do with every state and territory across the country, and that work's now underway. I don't want to just do this here in WA. I want to do a deal with every state and territory across the country to make sure that every single public school is funded at that full and fair level. That involves the Commonwealth chipping in. It's got to involve the states chipping in as well. Involves extra money. That's why it's important that we bring the budget back into balance, which we've done. But the money's important, Greg, but what's even more important is what we spend it on. We've got to fix that funding gap I talked about, where public schools aren't funded at the level that private schools are funded at. But we've also got to fix the education gap that exists in this country. And the fact is, we know today that 1 in 10 kids, when they're little, when they're 8 years old, are below the minimum literacy and numeracy standards we set for them. But 1 in 3 kids from poor families are below that level, and 1 in 3 kids from the bush are below that level. And think about this. This should shock everyone watching here today. Only 20% of those kids who fall behind, of all those kids who fall behind when they're little, ever catch up by the time they're in high school, which helps to explain why we're now seeing a drop in the number of kids finishing high school. Not everywhere, but we're seeing a drop in the percentage of kids finishing high school in public schools and kids from the bush, kids from poor families. And this is happening, mate, at a time where it's more important to finish school than it was when we went to school. You've got to finish school today because most of the jobs being created require you to go to TAFE or uni to get the qualifications for those jobs. So we've got to make sure that more people finish school. That means going right back to the start, identifying kids when they're falling behind when they're little and intervening early. So this money is important. What's even more important is using it on things like catch-up tutoring. Find a child who's falling behind, get them out of a classroom of 30, put them in a classroom of 3 or 4 or 5. And we know from what's happened in New South Wales and Victoria after the pandemic that a child like that can learn as much in 6 months as they would ordinarily learn in 12 months. So they catch up and then they get put back into the mainstream classroom where they can keep up. Ultimately, it means more kids finishing high school.
Yeah, no, that equity of opportunity argument is a compelling one, and I really don't want to get bogged down in a numbers and budgeting debate, but just on that specific question of the gap, if you like, the overfunding relative to the school resourcing standard in non-government schools, do you rule out any clawback, any transfer from non-government into these public deals that you're clinching this year?
Non-government schools are at that level now. Those schools that are above that 100% Gonski level are on a track to come down automatically. That's one of the features of the changes that Malcolm Turnbull made a number of years ago. So that'll happen automatically. Non-government schools come down to the 100% level. The real problem is that public schools aren't on a trajectory to get to that 100%. And it's 5% short. It's billions of dollars that need to be invested there. It requires the Commonwealth to chip in and it requires the states to chip in as well. But it also requires us to make sure that we tie the funding to the sort of things that we know are going to work for kids who go to schools like this, the sort of things that mums and dads at home would expect us to invest this money in, that are going to make a real difference in children's lives, help to make sure that more kids finish school. Ultimately, what this is about, whether it's the work we're doing here in schools, the work that I'm doing in universities, or the work that we're doing in early education, is building a better and a fairer education system for the whole country.
Yeah. Now, as you say, there is much the states will have to do. You've said before that you're not into writing blank cheques, and you've already run through here catch-up tutoring and other measures that will be written into these deals. But what are the consequences for the states if they underperform or under-deliver against some of those criteria?
Yeah, I've been asked before, you know, if a school doesn't reach a certain level, do you rip the money out? The answer to that's no. That would be, you know, that'd be contradictory to everything that we're trying to achieve here. I went to a disadvantaged school. You know, I went to a school where there was a lot of kids who had English as a second language, where there are lots of kids struggling, where every dollar matters. What we're trying to do here, what we're doing in WA and what I want to do across the country is tie the funding to reforms, to work together, Commonwealth government and state governments, to make sure that we tie this money to the sort of reforms that we can roll out across the nation, identify kids that are falling behind early and intervene early to help them. That's what this is about. And I'm doing great work with the states right now on making changes to the degrees that students do at university to become a teacher, to make sure they're better prepared, that they've got the skills that they need from day one to teach kids to read, to teach kids to write, teach kids doing maths, to improve the practical training that they get while they're still at university. That's a great example of the collaboration between the Commonwealth and the states. Yeah. I want to do the same thing here right across the country, fund our schools properly and use that funding to help the children who need it the most. All
right, an important first step you're taking unquestionably there in public schooling. Just to cover off a couple of other quick elements, we'll come to inflation in a moment, but one remaining one in your education portfolio. Universities remains a major piece of work for you. That's probably an understatement for this year. The Accord review, you have its full and final report. When will we get the government's response to that?
Yeah, I'll release that report shortly. And I mentioned a moment ago that this is not just about schools, it's about early education and it's about tertiary education as well. Just as I said that 1 in 3 kids from poor families are more likely to fall behind when they're little and not catch up, the data that we've got tells us that you've got around about 45% of young people in their 20s today with a university degree, but only about half that much for people from poor families. We've got to do more as a country to make sure that we help more people finish school and then go on to university. What the interim report of the Accord told us is that in the years ahead, more people are going to need a university degree because more and more jobs will require university qualifications. We've got to break down that barrier that exists, that artificial barrier between TAFE and university, make it easier for people to move between the two. We've also got to do more to help kids from the bush, help kids from poor families to make that big leap into university and get the skills they need for the jobs that are being created now and in the years ahead. I'm looking forward to releasing that report in the next couple of weeks.
All right, well, next couple of weeks, I reckon we might be able to pencil you in for a follow-up on that. Jason Clare, just finally, inflation's fallen faster than expected, ending last year at 4.1%. Timing is everything in these things. Is there some risk with your revamped Stage 3 tax cuts that the timing is out, that you're going to land them 5 to 6 months too late against the peak cost of living pressures?
Oh, we know that Aussies are doing it tough. That's why the childcare changes we've made that have cut the cost of childcare by 11% are important. That's why the changes we've made to cut the cost of medicine is important too. The changes we've made to help with electricity bills are important. But Aussies are still doing it tough. Journos like you are asking us, what more can we do? Giving every taxpayer a tax cut is an important part of helping Aussies with the cost of living, and making sure that 11 million Aussies get a bigger tax cut is a really important part of that. It's good that inflation's coming down. You bet it is. It's good that wages are going up. Wages are now going up at the fastest rate in 15 years. Unemployment's low as well, but there are lots of Aussies doing it tough, and that's why this tax cut for every Aussie taxpayer is important. What I find hard to believe is that Peter Dutton can't make up his mind about whether he thinks that 11 million Aussies deserve a bigger tax cut. He's quick to bag Woolies, he's quick to bag the journos up there in the press gallery, but he can't work out whether he supports 11 million Aussies getting a bigger tax cut. Tells you everything you need to know about Peter Dutton and his priorities.
Yeah, rest assured, we'll keep asking Peter Dutton and other members of the coalition about where they might land on Stage 3. Jason Clare, a warm day and a busy day for you there in Western Australia. We appreciate it, as always, whenever you can join us on Afternoon Briefing.
No worries, mate. Thank you.
And as we just heard there, by the Minister's own admission, there's a bit of wrangling still to go with other states and the Northern Territory to replicate versions of this new, in principle, WA public school funding deal. The federal opposition's monitoring the project as it's explained and executed by Jason Clare. Its spokeswoman, Sarah Henderson, has been speaking in Melbourne.
Today we have seen headlines and announcements of some $3 billion more of funding from the Albanese government for public schools. And yet we know this is smoke and mirrors, because the Minister has spoken a very big game about the National School Reform Agreement, but so far we have seen no national agreement and no school reforms. We have only seen an agreement in principle with the West Australian government. So here in Victoria, Victoria is in fact the worst for schools funding, apart from the Northern Territory. The Victorian Labor government is delivering only 70% of the schools funding required under the Gonski funding method, not the 80% that Gonski stipulated. So it's really disappointing that we haven't seen the states step up. And of course, we haven't seen Jason Clare put the blowtorch on the states.
All right, at this point, let's bring in our political panel for the day. And joining us from Melbourne, Labor's Assistant Health Minister Jed Carney is back. Welcome back, Jed. And Liberal MP Jenny Ware, the member for Hughes in Sydney South. Jenny's in Sydney. Welcome to you too. Jenny, look, a bit to get through. Why don't we start out on the economy and Stage 3 tax cuts? All roads lead to there at the moment. Jed, I'll go to you first of all. The justification for changing Stage 3 is that middle income Australia needs relief from cost of living pressures now, but the benefits don't arrive for another 5 months. And on the inflation trajectory that we're picking up today, the worst of the cost of living crisis could well be over by then, couldn't it? Doesn't that invite more action before then?
Well, that's very optimistic of you, Greg. Look, I think that would be great, but the fact of the matter is that people are telling us right now that they need cost of living relief, and I heard your interview with Minister Clare just before, and he very succinctly listed all of the factors, all of the things that the Labor government is doing to alleviate the cost of living for Australians who are really struggling right now. And it is good news that inflation is coming down. That just goes to show that all of these measures that we've introduced, which I might add the opposition screamed and yelled about would be inflationary, have in fact worked to lower inflation while at the same time giving good cost of living relief. And he mentioned a number of those like childcare, cheaper medicines, cheaper electricity bills, etc. So down the track, I think people can look forward to these stage 3 tax cuts having a further impact on the cost of living for them. It allows them to keep their budgets intact. It allows them to know that further relief is coming, and I'm sure no matter what happens in the next few months, that will be very, very welcome indeed.
All right, Jenny, where I'm sure you, like every member of the Liberal Party room, will be actively considering the best way to deal with this bill when it hits the Parliament. Now, helpfully, the government is breaking down electorate by electorate the number of people who will be better off under its plan. Are you now among those in your party recognising that it's getting harder, if not impossible, for Liberals and Nationals to vote against it in the Parliament, Jenny?
Well, first of all, Greg, this does, of course, represent another broken promise by the Albanese Labor government. The full stage 3 tax cuts won't be implemented following the backflip. We do need to consider the legislation. We've had announcements, but we've seen no legislation. And what will be particularly important, Greg, when this legislation comes before us, the Liberals will go through our usual party room processes. But what will be very important is how the Labor government deals with the Greens. The Greens will need to, the Labor government will need the support from the Greens to get this through, at least through the Senate. And the Greens have a very strange track record in regard to a lot of the comments and commitments the party has made around tax reform. So I think that we need to have a look at the legislation before we can form a view, but what will be very telling will be what arrangements the Labor Party needs to make with the Greens.
Sure thing. In the presentation of that argument, though, Jenny, where you almost make it sound like there's an incentive then for the coalition to get in and cut a deal that you might view as best in the available political circumstances, before the Greens would get to it.
Well, we certainly want to see cost of living relief for all Australians. It is it's the first, second, third, fourth and fifth issue for most Australians. So we certainly want to see cost of living relief. We've been calling upon that for months now from the government. And Greg, we need to see the legislation before we can consider our position, before we start any sort of negotiations or discussions with the government.
Yeah, and I understand that's a process that will play out or begin to play out further in Canberra next week. Jed, just to pick up Jenny's point there, is there room for the government to enlarge the total size of the package? I mean, it didn't really, did it, in the scope of the arrangements outlined last week, not over the first 4 years anyway. Is there an acceptance that the Greens might push you further?
I think that what the government has outlined is incredibly fair, and I think if you compare it to what the previous government had planned for these stage 3 tax cuts, it did not take into account the cost of living pressures on the lowest income earners in this country. And we have redistributed that money. It is the same packet of money that was flagged in the original legislation. It has been costed and is in the budget. So it's not, we hear from Treasury and from the RBA it will not be inflationary. I think this is a very responsible package, and I certainly hope it gets the support of the entire Parliament, including the coalition. I think you raised the issue of the fact that I think about 85% of people in coalition seats actually support the package and will get a very good savings in their income tax. So I think this is a good package. I'm hoping that the entire Parliament will support it. It's sensible, it's not inflationary, and it will give relief to the people who really, really need it the most.
And what's your outlook, Jenny, on those who were disadvantaged or relatively disadvantaged through the Labor changes to stage 3? I mean, we're talking higher income earners, particularly those over $190,000. Will it be a Liberal ambition to fully restore to them the benefits they might have got before Labor had made these changes, Jenny?
Greg, we have to, as I've said, we need to look at the legislation itself. We need to consider the full ramifications of it and the impacts it will have for all Australians across all of our electorates, and that includes Australians at all income levels. So really, until, with all Labor policies and announcement, the devil is always in the detail, and so we are waiting for the detail before we can make any other commitments around where we will go with future policy.
All right. Tax reform, Jed Carney, I think you might have read today, as I did, that business groups are generally, through their peak bodies at least, somewhat despairing about the room to manoeuvre on further deep-rooted tax reform in this country. So much so, I think they're talking about organising a summit among themselves. Now that one key tax policy has been broken and redrawn, though, does that clear the way for Labor to press into other areas? What's next? Capital gains, negative gearing?
Well, I think the Treasurer has made it clear that with taxing multinational corporations and making sure that they pay their fair share of tax and redistributing this income, this tax reform, right across the entire economy, not leaving out our lowest income earners, giving it to where it really needs most, has been quite broad tax reform. And given the good response we're getting from the community, I think people are really welcoming it. I have children in their 30s, all of whom have mortgages. And when I sort of flagged them as a bellwether for me, what do you think about it? They said, well, Mum, this is going to help us. And I think that is the good thing about this reform. I think the Treasurer has made it clear that there's no further reform on the agenda. But, you know, this was a big step forward for the Labor government to do this. It was a responsible thing to do. It was the right thing to do. And I think the Prime Minister has shown that he can be trusted to make right decisions around these issues, big issues for our economy and for everyday Australians. And I think it's been warmly welcomed as it is.
All right, Jenny, last one on tax, because we'll move to some health and social issues in a moment. But do you share the view of big business lobby groups in particular that this appears to be the end of the road for wholesale tax reform?
Well, I think that we've heard this week that there have been those from the Labor caucus, Labor backbenchers speaking under the cloak of anonymity to say that they are concerned, they want to see changes to negative gearing, for example. We haven't had it firmly ruled out that there won't be those changes. We've also, I'd like to see the government make a firm commitment that there'll be no changes, for example, for taxes on the family home or a wealth tax and other taxes that have been making headlines and have been discussed recently. So I think that there is, the government does need to go further than it has so far in explaining to Australians what future tax reform it does have, it is considering.
All right, let's continue with that when you all return to Canberra next week. Medicare turns 40 tomorrow, and Jed Carney, as Assistant Health Minister, you'll be involved in various forms of celebrations. I'll ask you about the celebratory nature of that in just a moment, but on a substantive question, bulk billing incentives for doctors, the budget threw a lot of money at it, more than $3 billion, as I recall, over 4 to 5 years. What benchmark increases in bulk billing rates do we expect, or would you set to go with that investment?
Well, I understand there's going to be some data released in the next few days, Greg, that will give us a good idea of what is happening out there. I know there's been lots of commentary around bulk billing rates and targets and various measures being used right across various commentary platforms. I think the Minister made it clear that the previous government, the coalition, has been using sort of COVID data, which would be very skewed, of course, given the pandemic. Anecdotally, though, I am hearing, and we are hearing, that bulk billing rates have improved, albeit patchily, across the country. Some areas it has improved a lot more than others. So I think it's important not to really leap to conclusions, but to wait and see what the data will tell us. But I have to say that, Australians love Medicare. They are very proud of it. It has endured these 40 years. And it is something I think that the Labor government, as opposed to the coalition when they were in government, is something that we are 100% committed to improving. We've tripled bulk billing rates. We have increased indexation to the point where some GPs have had between a 34% and a 50% increase in income, depending on whether you are regional or in the city. We've introduced an hour-long items under Medicare, which is, can I just say, a huge bonus, particularly for women who often present with sort of vague-like symptoms like pelvic pain that really need investigation. We really are working hard. We are committed to Medicare, and we want to see it accessible and affordable right across the country.
Okay, I will ask you a follow-up in a moment. But Jenny, on bulk billing, since that's where I took Jed, do you have, anecdotally even, any indication that this enlarged incentive is working in your part of the world?
Look, first of all, happy birthday, I suppose, to Medicare. It is a very important part of the Australian health policy, is the retention of Medicare. I am seeing in my electorate that bulk billing rates are declining at an alarming rate, and my seat is in the city. I also did some of the recent figures that we've seen is that overall bulk billing across the country is at about a 10-year low at around 77%. And so it's certainly my experience, I'm hearing from doctors in my electorate as well as from patients, that bulk billing rates are declining at a very, very fast rate.
And therefore, Jenny, where that this fledgling, I think it's only been operating for 3 months now, enlarged incentive is what? Not working?
That's not the evidence that I've seen in my electorate. And I would also say that when Jed is talking about expanding Medicare, Medicare particularly has been the psychological sessions that were Medicare funded. The coalition government had brought it in, so there were 20 sessions per calendar year. That's now been slashed to 10, and despite the coalition constantly asking for that to be reinstated, the government has refused to reinstate those. And I think particularly at a time where we now recognise that there are significant mental health challenges for many throughout our whole country, and I think that is something that the government should be looking at doing and should change its position on that as a matter of urgency and priority.
All right. Look, just to round it all out on a slightly lighter note, what's not to love about a celebration? But Jed Cunny, why do we need to have a travelling roadshow, an information campaign, printed logos on cards and other paraphernalia for a system which is still going to be there the day after tomorrow? How much are we spending on the party element of this birthday?
You asked me a question I really don't know the answer to on how much, but it's, a celebration is a celebration. People love Medicare, and I think why not? Why not get her out and celebrate it? And I think you'll find that people will enjoy it, and they'll come out and say, yes, we love Medicare. It's something worth celebrating. Bob Hawke and all those great people who instigated it 40 years ago have, said they never believed it would still be here 40 years later. It was constantly attacked by Liberal governments and coalition governments in the past, and it's stayed the course now. So worth celebrating.
Okay, let's not re-prosecute that. Last word to you, Jenny Ware. You on board for a party, even if it does involve a little bit of taxpayer expense?
Well, I think that this is a matter of style over substance, and as I said, Greg, I think that Australians would much prefer that the Medicare system, that bulk billing rates were increased, and also that things like restoring those extra 10 psychological sessions per year for people suffering from mental health difficulties were restored, and the coalition has also, in terms of women's health, has announced that it would give $4 million to ovarian cancer research, and that there would be further funding for women for both diagnosis and treatment for ovarian cancer through Medicare. So I think that Australians would rather see funding going through in meaningful ways rather than some balloons and stickers, Greg.
But it's not an either-or situation, Greg. Of course, we've got a huge investment in women's health. I'm so proud of the endometriosis clinics and the stuff that I'm doing in my portfolio. And the psychology sessions, as we know, we're not going to the people who needed them. In fact, 45,000 people were blocked from getting any mental health care because of the design of that system. So it's worth revisiting that system and making sure it works for everybody.
Noted both, and my takeout is neither side is proposing to, demolish Medicare at or on its 40th birthday. So maybe that much we can all celebrate. Jenny Ware, Jed Carney, we'll get you both back again before too long. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Greg.
See you, Jenny.
Bye-bye, Jed.
Okay, so let's go back to our top story of the day, which is, of course, the economy. We've had those inflation numbers for late last year showing the heat's coming out of it, or as the Treasurer put it today, inflation is slowing, real wages are growing, tax cuts are flowing. Well, despite Labor's exhortations, the Coalition hasn't yet declared its position on the overhauled Stage 3 tax cuts. Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor's in Perth. He's just spoken to reporters there on both of these subjects. Here's a part of that.
Inflation figures out today, and there's absolutely nothing in these numbers that's going to reverse the collapse Australians are seeing in the purchasing power of their incomes, in their real disposable incomes. We've seen that drop by 8.6% in the 18 months Labor has been in government. For a typical Australian, they're $8,000 worse off in terms of their purchasing power of their income than they were 18 months ago. And that's why Australians are really feeling the pinch right now. Now, they've been hit on three fronts. We've seen prices rising substantially faster than wages, and prices have gone up 10% in the last 18 months. We've seen 12 interest rate increases under Labor, and of course that's causing enormous pain to anyone with a mortgage. That $8,000 is much higher for a typical mortgage holder, and we've seen a sharp increase in personal income taxes being paid by Australians, a 27% increase in personal income taxes. Great for a government that wants to spend more money, but terrible for the budget of Australian households. And those three things combined, rising prices faster than wages, rising mortgage payments and rising taxes, are crushing the budgets of Australian households, and we're seeing that every single day. The answer to this is economic management. It's not robbing Peter to pay Paul. It's strong, sound, traditional economic management, which Labor is completely incapable of. Time and time again in government, it demonstrates it can't manage the economy, and Australians are worse off as a result, and that's what we keep seeing in the numbers coming through on a regular basis. The truth of the matter is Labor's failure in economic management costs every single Australian. And they can try to rob Peter to pay Paul to fix the situation, but that won't do it because they're completely incapable of doing the things you have to do to manage an economy, to have the sort of standard of living that Australians had just over 18 months ago. And that means managing spending, not spending another $209 billion since they came into power, sensible industrial relations where workers and employers sit down together to make their workplaces more productive, making sure immigration is in line with our housing supply, and so on down the list, making sure competition policy is focused on competitive pricing for Australians, not crony capitalism as we've seen with Labor's attitude towards the airlines industry. So there is a better way, and that better way means Australians' collapse in living standards is reversed, but we're seeing absolutely nothing from Labor that suggests they have a plan or even an idea about how to do that, right to the point where the Prime Minister himself has been asking in the last week journalists what their ideas are about how to reverse that collapse in standards of living. But it's also clear that their They're robbing Peter to pay Paul is not going to do the job. $15 a week is not going to make the difference in terms of the collapse in living standards Australians have seen. Happy to take questions.
Most economists seem to suggest that rates will go down this year. Doesn't that suggest that the government's doing something right?
Well, you know, we've seen a collapse in living standards and there's no sign of a reversal of that collapse in living standards. Nothing is going to give Australians that $8,000 back, or substantially more for mortgage holders, that they've lost. There's no plan to get back to where we were when we were in government. Absolutely none whatsoever. And this is the problem with Labor. At the end of the day, if you want everyone to be better off, you've got to manage the economy the right way. And this is what Labor's failing to do, and the results are clear.
On your Peter and Paul comment, the government says that 85% of people in coalition-held electorates would be better off under their revised tax cuts. Does this mean you should support the plan to support your constituents?
You know, every Australian was better off under a Liberal government. Every Australian was better off under a Liberal government. The average Australian has lost $8,000 of purchasing power in their incomes. The purchasing power of their incomes and their pay packets has dropped by $8,000. Rising mortgage payments, rising prices, rising taxes, and $15 a week ain't going to do the job. It's simply not. The trouble with Labor is they don't know how to manage the economy. And every Australian benefits from managing the economy. You don't have to divide Australians when you manage the economy the right way. Everyone gets the opportunity to get ahead. We believe in aspiration. We believe in hard-working Australians getting ahead. That's what Labor's failed to achieve.
Okay, so then you'll have to take a position on those tax cuts.
Sure.
Eventually, what about those 85% of people?
Well, have you seen the legislation yet? Because I haven't. And I tell you what, the grimy Greens are going to get their hands on it sometime soon. And who knows what they're going to look like at the end of that. So we'll look at this closely. We haven't seen the legislation. What we do believe in, for all Australians, is lower, simpler, fairer taxes. We've been fighting for that for a long time, for 2 elections indeed. Stage 1, 2 and 3 tax cuts, which gave tax cuts right across the broad sweep of tax brackets in Australia. We believe in lower taxes, and we are the party of lower taxes, and we'll continue to fight for that.
So you mentioned the legislation, but the government has released the Treasury advice along with its proposals. So they're saying the detail is there.
The detail from the Treasury advice? There's no legislation in the Treasury advice. There's no negotiation with the Greens in the Treasury advice. What we see in the Treasury advice is a political document which has been issued, but what we need is the detail, and we'll make our decision in good time. But the one thing you can be absolutely confident of is we believe in lower, fairer, simpler taxes. We've been the one fighting for it. We don't believe that a Prime Minister and Treasurer should be able to make a commitment to Australians over 100 times and break that promise. I mean, this is an egregious breach of trust with the Australian people. If we are now in a world where they can make that promise that many times, how can we listen to a word Labor says? I mean, what is their plan on negative gearing? What is their plan on capital gains tax on their family home? What are their true plans in terms of franking credits? And this doesn't... Labor has clearly decided they'll do whatever they want, no matter what they've said in the past. And every Australian should be concerned about that.
Do you trust, though, the Treasury?
OK, so that was Angus Taylor speaking in Perth a moment ago. Now, strikingly, the coalition still hasn't got a declared position on those stage 3 tax cuts, but that remains a work in progress, perhaps upon their return to Canberra for Parliament's resumption for the year next week. Moving on, heavy rainfalls from the tail of ex-tropical cyclone Kirrily continue to soak parts of Queensland and also to soak up enormous efforts from emergency responders. It keeps the Prime Minister in Queensland today. He's been taking briefings with Premier Stephen Miles while also opening another of the government's Medicare urgent care clinics.
We thank again all those extraordinary emergency service workers, SES members who this morning, again just up the road here at Marumba Downs, we had the opportunity to thank personally the people who have been out there, some of whom had been up to Townsville over the weekend helping their fellow Queenslanders and were back here helping their neighbours. And that is the sort of spirit that we consistently see, that at the worst of times we see the best of the Australian character. And here in Queensland we see the strength of the fortitude and resilience that Queenslanders have, but the determination to help each other, and that is a fantastic thing.
Away from Queensland, taxpayer handouts have been secured today by Australia's biggest steel makers. Chris Bowen has today made 2 allocations worth a combined total of $200 million to help BlueScope Steel in Port Kembla and Liberty Steel in South Australia to try and clean up their acts, environmentally speaking. The 2 firms will improve or replace their blast furnaces, which in turn is meant to reduce carbon emissions. In total, Chris Bowen says workforces at both plants will increase in size, 250 extra workers at Port Kembla and apparently a 25% growth over time in Whyalla.
Both Liberty and BlueScope are on different journeys, but they have the same destination, and that is decarbonisation. And we're supporting both of them in those efforts. And what we don't want to see, and we won't let see, is other countries making steel without the sort of carbon constraints that we have in Australia, and Australian competitiveness being impacted. So hence we work very carefully to design the safeguard mechanism to reduce emissions on site, but also to protect those trade-exposed emission-intensive industries like steelmaking. And the establishment of the sub-fund out of the Powering the Regions Fund, or the Critical Inputs to Renewable Manufacturing Fund, was an important part of doing that. As Tanya said, BlueScope is committed, Liberty is committed. This is a hard-to-abate sector, steelmaking. I mean, green steel is coming, but it's not here yet.
All right, well, in the interests of accountability, we have one more matter to cover off for you today. The creation of the country's National Anti-Corruption Commission last year was proclaimed as a massive leap forward for transparency over public servants, politicians and others in federal positions of trust and power. But an annual stock take on Australia's performance in this area suggests the dial hasn't exactly shifted much yet, at least in comparison with other countries it hasn't. Transparency International regularly ranks countries for their cleanliness and corruption-fighting zest. So to gauge where Australia comes out this year, Transparency International's local chief executive, Clancy Moore, joins us now. Clancy, welcome to the program. Just to take us through, what are you actually measuring in your corruption perception index, and where does Australia come out comparatively?
So the Corruption Perceptions Index uses 13 different data sources. This includes institutions like the World Economic Forum and the Freedom Justice Project. And literally thousands of experts and business people contribute to these surveys. And what it does, it gives 180 countries a score from 0, being highly corrupt, to 100 being clean. And this year, Australia scores 75 out of 100, the same score as last year, which shows there's a bit more room to be, more to be done.
And I don't want to zero in unfairly on an entity which is only just being stood up, but part of my introduction, Clancy, obviously alluded to the creation of the National Anti-Corruption Commission. We know as a matter of record, because it updates us every week, that it's fielded 2,500 referrals, excluded or filtered out 2,000 of them, and it's picking through roughly the 500 that remain. State organisations of a similar ilk are also active. What more needs to be done, though, if Australia's rankings in this area are to pick up?
Yeah, so in 2012, Australia scored 85 out of 100 and was actually 7th place in the global corruption fighting effort. So I think, this year's a really crucial year for the Albanese government. We've got an election sometime in 2025. And there's a real need to move forward on some important commitments that the Albanese government has made. This includes things like greater transparency over political donations, who funds our political parties and candidates, but also real-time disclosure of those donations as well. We have seen, as you rightly pointed out, really strong foundations by the Albanese government, including the creation of the very historic National Anti-Corruption Commission last year, but there is more to be done for Australia to be a global leader once again.
Okay, so on the political transparency side, donations and other, I think we call them in this country, electoral reform measures, is there an expectation that those promises, and I don't think we can safely categorise them as promises, that there will be movement on that this year?
Absolutely. The government has been pretty clear, and there was a cross-parliamentary committee, the Joint Standing Committee for Electoral Matters, which looked at that exact issue, and they recommended greater transparency of political donations, but also real-time disclosure as well, and other things like misinformation and tackling misinformation in politics. Australia also has very opaque lobbying laws, particularly at the federal level. So we'd like to see greater transparency around who lobbyists meet with, the publishing of ministers' and politicians' diaries as well.
All right. And what about the international dimension to all of this, Clancy? I know Transparency International, as the name would suggest, looks at the cross-border efforts of Australia and other nations to help quash flourishing corruption elsewhere in this region. How is Australia's offshore or international component of its anti-corruption regime going?
Yeah, so look, across the Asia Pacific, countries are generally stalling in their efforts to tackle corruption. The average score is 45 out of 100, and Australia plays a real key role. Unfortunately, we're often a destination for money laundering. We have corrupt officials and kleptocrats investing money in real estate, as an example, but also quite a few examples of foreign bribery in the last year. Just to name a few, we saw allegations against government contractors involved in offshore processing as one example. So Australia can do more on those two key issues, combating foreign bribery, but also catching up on anti-money laundering laws as well.
All right, well, an ongoing piece of work. I'm not going to say we'll wait till this time next year to track progress. Clancy Moore, with a bit of luck, we might be able to do that with you in the interim. But thanks for that update on your Perceptions report out, I think, today. Thanks for joining us.
Great, thanks a lot.
All right, we're about to wrap up. Before we do, though, a bit of breaking news to hand. Many Australians might have awoken to news that yesterday Imran Khan, the former cricketer and Prime Minister once upon a time of Pakistan, he'd yesterday been convicted in a court and along with a party deputy for leaking state secrets, and been handed 10-year prison sentences. Well, there have been further developments in Pakistan today. Another quite separate court has sentenced the former Prime Minister, Imran Khan, and his wife to 14 years in prison for corruption. So just repeating that, a fresh 14-year corruption prison sentence handed down to Imran Khan and his wife. The party that he used to lead, and which is still arguing vociferously for him, says Khan has been disqualified from holding public office for a decade ahead of next month's parliamentary elections. So the full weight of Pakistani law being thrown against Imran Khan. That news just to hand. Some people, of course, in that country, including in his party, see it as an injustice, not a justice process. That news just coming to hand, but we are done on Afternoon Briefing for today. Joe O'Brien and his team are up with you next, and we'll see you tomorrow.